He is Professor Robert Shiller, SM 68 and PhD 72. I'm particularly delighted to be introducing him because in the spring of 1983, my first year of graduate school, I had the great good fortune of having him as a faculty member in one of my classes. So it's a delight to be able to introduce him to you today. Professor Shiller is the Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale University and Professor of Finance and a Fellow at the International Center for Finance at the Yale School of Management. He received his BA from the University of Michigan in 1967 and his PhD in economics from MIT in '72. Professor Shiller has authored a dozen books that have been translated into dozens more languages, including Irrational Exuberance and Animal Spirits, co-authored with George Akerlof, PhD 66 from MIT. He also helped develop the housing market data analysis tools known as the Case-Shiller Home Price Indices. Shiller writes a regular economic review column for the New York Times and occasional columns for The Guardian. In 2013, Professor Shiller earned the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences along with Eugene Fama and Lars Peter Hansen for their empirical analysis of asset prices. MIT has had 84 winners of Nobel Prizes with a connection to the Institute. 5 people have won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences while serving as members of the MIT faculty. Another 9 MIT alumni, including Professor Shiller, have won the prize. And an additional 4 former faculty have won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. That seems to be one of our strongest areas. Professor Shiller places great value in his family. He and his wife, Virginia, have 2 sons, Benjamin, an assistant professor of economics at Brandeis, and Derek, a visiting assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. After his talk, Professor Shiller will take questions from the audience, and signed copies of his latest book, Fishing for Fools, The Economics of Manipulation and Deception, will be available outside this hall after lunch for a cash-only cost of $20. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Shiller.
Thank you. Well, I've been away from MIT for 30 years. I'm teaching at Yale University, but it's really nice to be back. I think Yale, my experience since Yale, I'm sorry, at Yale I never forget what happened to me at MIT. I can't get my words right now, but in fact, right over there, you can see the MIT chapel. I was married there to my wife, Ginny, and we're celebrating our 40th anniversary next year. Thank you. Not only that, but we had our wedding reception in this room. But I think my experience at MIT has other dimensions and facets. One of them is a kind of can-do attitude that I think maybe seeped into my spirit during my years at MIT. One thing that I've thought, and I don't know if other people have the same reaction, every university or college has a motto and a seal. I think MIT has the best one. The motto of MIT, of course it's in Latin because this is 19th century, mens et manus, mind and hand. And the MIT traditional insignia shows a scholar and a craftsman together. So that represents a moral imperative that I took from it to make things happen for the public good. And that I suppose, leads me into what I said I would talk about today, which is my new book with George Akerlof. I should also add George Akerlof is MIT PhD as well in economics. So we've written a book with a kind of strange title. The title is Fishing for Fools, the Economics of Manipulation and Deception. We spell phishing with a PH, so it suggests that we're talking about computers, but that's only part of what we're talking about, because we're using phishing as a metaphor for all kinds of manipulation and deception that people are used to. We like to use the computer word phishing because I think that you're probably more aware of that than other kinds of deception. You've probably been warned, I hope you've been warned, not to click on something that looks suspicious. We also, and this is a little odd for an academic book, we misspelled fools deliberately, P-H-O-O-L. And a fool is someone who doesn't appreciate how often he or she is being fished. So that's the theme of our book. So I don't know how many of you here are connected to economics. Some of you, I suppose. MIT has a famous economics department and undergraduate courses. I actually taught here one semester as teaching undergraduates. So I know that you have a program here. But I assume most of you are not connected directly to economics. The book that we wrote is, this is what happens to people as they get older. You start wanting to correct long-standing errors that you see in your profession. Maybe not exactly error, but problems of emphasis. So what we're getting at is free markets and the proper attitude toward them. The idea that has taken hold in the econ profession and in much of the world is that the greatness of this country can be attributed to its free markets. We value liberty, and we have economic liberty as well, and the outcome of that is very good. We don't disagree with that, but I think we want to operate in shades of gray. That's partly true, but it's not the whole truth. The problem is, and this is something that we've felt for a long time, maybe it's obvious, but then again, maybe it's not so obvious, that there's a lot of deception. The free market economy incentivizes people to play tricks. Now, you, of course, know that. No one would claim that nobody ever plays tricks on you. But the question is how pervasive. So we wanted to write a book about it. Maybe it's because we think that there are other books that talk about tricks that are played in the economy. But there's something wrong, we thought, in emphasis. We're trying to get the emphasis right. A lot of books, both George Akerlof and I, as teenagers, read Vance Patrick's book, The Hidden Persuaders. Anyone know of this book? It's faded in history, but it was a remarkable book about advertising and all the psychological tricks they play on you. But we thought, they don't quite get it right. If you read Vance Patrick, it comes across as a conspiracy story, that there are some evil people, namely marketers, who are committing a conspiracy against you, and you should be really angry. But we have a different feeling about it, that what actually happens is not because of the ill will of a few bad business people. It's really the outcome of, it's partly one of the bad outcomes of completely unregulated, unsupervised free markets. So we talk about a fishing equilibrium. And we want to think that this is an important concept. It unfortunately does not always sit well with some free market libertarian types. But I think they should like it, because this is, let me give you an example. the most familiar example, at least among older people here, of a fishing equilibrium. Did you ever notice when you go to a grocery store that at the checkout, typically you're standing in line waiting to pay for your selected items. They have candy bars right there. Now, this, about 30 years ago, some socially conscious people decided to make a stink about this. They said, I know what you're doing. Here I am checking out of the grocery store. I've just spent 45 minutes shopping. I'm tired. Maybe I have a small child with me, okay? And here we are now standing in line. It's the worst possible ending to an unpleasant experience, standing in line. And then right in front of us are these candy bars. And so there was a complaint, sort of a mini social movement started. But some grocery stores announced that they wouldn't do that anymore. Okay, and that, if you look on the newspaper trail, it disappears after that. What happened? I'll tell you, the candy bars are back, and they're not. And I think many people still dimly remember that this was an outrage that they do this. So why do they do this? Well, I'm going to ask you to try to picture yourself as a grocery store manager. This is your new job, okay? It's probably not in your description of jobs you thought you would like to take. But just imagine. The first thing you would learn as a new manager of a grocery store is that it's a competitive business. Profit margins are very tight. You got to work, and you'll see other grocery stores going out of business. They fail to make a profit. So you then think, it's absolutely imperative that I make a profit here. So what is the typical profit margin? Something like 2%. And you think 2% of sales is your profit. That's awfully small. I've got to be really careful. Changing my prices by 2% is a big decision. If I'm going to lower my prices, maybe it'll bring in more business. But if it doesn't, I'm done, right? I don't have any profits anymore. So then you reflect on this candy bar thing. Should I do that? Well, that might add 0.5% to my profits. Should I do that? I think that you can easily imagine making the decision, look, this is the real world. Nobody's complaining about this. It's so tight. The competition is so tight that I cannot do otherwise. I feel some responsibility to my employees, and I'll just do it. In fact, I'll copy just about everything that everybody else does, no matter how bad it looks. As long as there's no law against it, I'll do it. So that's a fishing equilibrium. So it's not an equilibrium with bullies or awful people. Now I want to contrast that with what is taught at the MIT Department of Economics. I know I just talked to an assistant professor here. He said, oh, we're covering that next week. So it's really still alive. And that is the optimality of a competitive free market equilibrium. And there's something called the fundamental theorem of welfare economics. I looked up textbooks. MIT has textbooks. And I think I actually got the PhD textbook for microeconomic theory. And it prominently features this. So what is the fundamental theorem of welfare economics? It's a difficult mathematical proof for it, but based on certain assumptions. The assumptions are, everyone maximizes their utility. Their utility is a function of the goods they buy. They care only about themselves. No altruism, no society here. And there are no externalities. So what I do, what I consume there's no air pollution problem. And it's all competitive. And it's tight profit margins, okay? The theorem says that the economic equilibrium is Pareto optimal. And I have to tell you, many of you know what I'm talking about, but I'll have to define that. Vilfredo Pareto was an economist around late 19th century, early 20th century, who said that what we want of an economic system is an allocation of resources such that it's impossible to make everyone better off. You can make, it's okay if you could make someone better off. You can always make someone better off if you're a government. You can take from one person and give to another person. That'll make someone better off. But he said, Pareto said, economics should be focused on economic efficiency. And that means not missing any opportunity to make everyone better off. And then Pareto's theorem, which was then embellished and broadened by mathematical economists over the generations, says that if it's free market, it's the best possible outcome. Now that idea had been anticipated by someone's supposed to show me time cards, and I don't even see where you are. Oh, there you are back there. I've got 10 minutes, okay. There's a famous, Adam Smith wrote a book in 1776 called The Wealth of Nations. And there's one of his most famous quotes from that book. I don't have it written, but it's something like this. It's not for an appeal to benevolence that I get my dinner. The butcher, the baker, the brewer give me my dinner because I pay them. And then Smith said, all these social reformers, I'm skeptical whether they do me any good. It's the profit-maximizing business that does me good. So that is quoted, and it's become very much a philosophy of life, which appeals differently to different people. But I think, and there's an essential element of truth to that. But at the same time, it's not really the whole truth. And that's what our book is about. In fact, Adam Smith, the same guy, wrote another book, which is rarely cited these days, published in 1759, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And on page 1 of that book, he says, basically, people are not selfish. They're only partly selfish, and they care about others. So his idea that we want to have an economic system based entirely on self-interest it's not even correctly quoting Adam Smith. Moreover, Vilfredo Pareto, whom I mentioned, who invented Pareto optimality, he himself did not believe in it, and in fact dropped out of the economics profession and became a sociologist for the last 30 years of his life. I think the problem is that it's neglecting how easy it is to deceive people and manipulate them in a free market economy. And if there's no restraint on doing that, that kind of thing will happen. When you see an example, you know it, when you recognize it, but you don't see all of the examples put together in one place. So I have so many examples in the book. I don't know which one to give you. Let me just mention, and there's many books that are written about individual acts of this, but like there was a bestseller last year called Salt, Sugar, Fat by Michael Moss, illustrating all the things that are done to trick you. Notably, the book I'm just giving one example from his book, Coca-Cola, that's the dominant beverage. Why? You know, I personally have never understood. I think it tastes fine. I don't care. You put any soda before me, they're all the same. Maybe you taste something I don't. But what he details is that Coca-Cola has been an aggressive marketer. They have what they call the war room at Coca-Cola, and they're vicious against their competitors. One thing that Coca-Cola does is it had the theory going way back that you sell a beverage like Coca-Cola by attaching it in people's memories with good experiences. Did any of you see this movie that's out now called Inside Out, about what happens inside an 11-year-old girl's brain? Well, I can tell you the brief idea is that inside your brain there are these pre-programmed emotions. Your brain is like a computer, and it has motivational, it's got reward systems that, and that part of what your brain does, it has a filing system. It's like a computer, but it files memories with emotions attached. So if you remember something, it comes with an emotion. This is the system. It's the amygdala in the brain. The right amygdala attaches emotions of fear, and the left amygdala, I'm not a neuroscientist, but. So Coke just really understood that, and they would show TV skits on advertisements of people, and beautiful young people at the beach drinking Coca-Cola, and they just did this again and again. I'll give you another example, which I think is quite striking, and that is of slot machines. Slot machines, the gambling machines, were invented in the 1890s, and immediately it was remarked that to some people, they're addictive. They would just play all day. And you'd think, oh, come on now, you're losing every day. You're playing all these little bets by the law of averages. You're just going to lose all the time. I mean, there's no skill involved. Why do you do this? And some of these people would say, you know, I can't stop. It just puts me in a different frame of mind. So in her book, Addiction by Design, Natasha Schull describes the efforts to make a better slot machine, okay? And what do you think they're trying to do with their better slot machine? Addict you, of course. And it's not because they're evil. Now imagine that you took a job, this may be harder, you're working for a slot machine manufacturer, and you do a good job in whatever you do, right? So you find out that there's a scholarly literature on this, and there's much research on how to make it better. One thing they've learned is that there's like a feedback loop. It's called, you get stuck in a do loop, is the way I like to describe it. That's Fortran. But if you don't write a computer program right, there will be some error that you're vulnerable to, and you might end up doing something repetitively. I'm influenced by another book I recommend is Dean Buonamano's book, Brain Bugs. He's a neuroscientist, and he talks about mistakes that are programmed into your brain. You kind of are born with a computer program. I was telling you how reward system works and how emotions are attached to memories. But I think of the computer as a system, your brain as a computer program that evolved over millions of years through a Darwinian evolution. But it's not done yet. It's not perfect. So it's got bugs in it. And you maybe are aware of some of the bugs. Like, for example, you push these sweet things away from you at this table because you know that you will succumb to temptation. But professionals want to push them back. That's what happens in a fishing economy. So now they've learned that people are trying to stop pushing the button. And the important thing is don't let anything interrupt the sequence. The optimal time is 3.5 seconds. You push every 3.5 seconds. And there's a reward to the anticipation that you might win. And just as that's dying down, the guy should push again. And so they discovered that you don't want anything to interrupt that. It used to be old slot machines used to pour coins out. They thought that was very dramatic when you won. But they discovered through careful research that some people, well, now what do I do with all these coins? I got to put them somewhere. And that kind of interrupts the zone they were in, and they stopped gambling. So now they don't do that anymore. Instead, they have the simulated digital sound of coins falling. And then it says, do you want to bet again? And it works. People will stay longer. So I'm just about out of time, I think. I wanted to conclude, though, that what makes this country great is not exclusively our free markets. We've never been free markets. If slot machines, for example, were allowed, there'd be slot machines in this room, all around it. They were going on being everywhere, but it's regulation that has stopped them. So we have a civil society. And I think that the greatness of this country and of other leading countries has something to do with civil society and social movements and heroes. Okay, so, but let me, civil society, I have 1 minute, is a term coined by Cicero in ancient Rome, societas civilis. It's an old term, but it's important. And what I was going to do at the end, I only have 1 minute, is to ask, I've been doing this, I've been doing book talks, and I've discovered that my heroes and the heroes of our book are not very well known. I was asking for a show of hands. Who can tell me who various people are? I'll just do this quickly. These are leaders who helped root out certain kinds of manipulation and deception in our markets in the past. Florence Kelley, okay? It's really, don't be embarrassed. This happens with every audience that I try. Florence Kelley in 1899 set up the National Consumers League that tested products for safety and put a white label. I think it's gone now. You don't see white label anymore on safe products. Okay, another one. There's a pair. Alice Lakey and Harvey Washington Wiley. Okay, I don't see anyone. Take a guess. Anyway, these people campaigned for testing of medicines. As of 1900, most medicines that were sold in drugstores were fraudulent. And if you tested, you looked at what's in them, it wasn't even consistent. They didn't care. They just put anything in, the flavorings. Well, I'll do Stuart Chase and Frederick Schlink. These are some of the most important people in America. What they did is advocated that we need a consumer magazine that tests products and reports. They said in their 1920s book, Your Money's Worth, they said, you go to a drugstore and look for toothpaste. There'll be 10 different brands there. Now there's 100 different brands maybe, but there were 10, and they all make claims. How do you know? How does anyone know what to buy? So the result of them was the creation in 1936 of Consumer Reports. You've heard of that, I think. So these were all examples. Now, these were all non-profits or government activities, but they come from individuals, and they're individuals who are part of civil society and care about it. And so in the end, what I've learned at MIT as a graduate student is still applicable, but we have to remember the other side and the other important aspects of human nature that tend to get overwhelmed in our current departmental atmosphere. I'll stop with that, and we're going to do questions. Now, I know I probably aroused the wrath of some of you. I know that because anything that talks, free markets is a very delicate topic, and it almost seems unpatriotic to criticize free markets. But the other side is that we aren't criticizing the idea that the free market system is like a game that we set up to incentivize and motivate people and give them free rein to do things. But when they mess up and they're hurting people, we stop it. And that's the thing we're saying. We're trying to get a better focus and perspective on it. But at some of my book talks, I've had angry comments. I'm ready for it if you want to do it. Yes, there's a microphone here.
Dr. Shiller, a question referring more back to your earlier book, Irrational Exuberance. You recently said, I believe I'm correct on this, within the past month or so, that you thought that we might be in a particular state like that, especially concerning equities. Am I correct that I heard you talk possibly about as much as a 30% cut in the Dow, resulting from 17,000 to 11,000? Yeah. Could you give us a timetable? Or
well, that was in my New York Times column at the end of August. And at that time, I like to talk about the stock market, but it's such a loaded issue. And the problem is that nobody can really predict it very well. But I am less optimistic than the average person, and I wanted to somehow convey that. So I decided in writing it to say, it wouldn't surprise me if the Dow were at 11,000 in 2 years. But then I followed that up with, on the other hand, it might go up. So, but see, I don't think I'm fishing here. I think I'm trying to convey my state of knowledge. So I have concerns based on evidence that I have collected. So one piece of evidence is that I have a price-earnings ratio that John Campbell and I developed called the cyclically adjusted price-earnings ratio, which is real stock price divided by a 10-year average of real earnings. And we found that that relation well over 100 years has done somewhat well to predict long-term stock market action. It doesn't tell you timing. We have an R-squared of about a third on a regression. I'm sorry, this is MIT, right? I can talk like this. We had an R-squared of about a third on a regression of 10-year returns onto the CAPE ratio. So that's only a third of the variation in the long-term return is predicted. Based on that, that regression, we would predict positive returns over the next 10 years, but weaker than usual. Maybe like 3% a year real. Still okay. On the other hand, so there's other pieces of evidence, though. One of them is I do questionnaire surveys of investors. Thank you if any of you filled out my survey, but you probably didn't because it's a random sample of the US population. There are not that many of you here compared. But one question I asked is, do you think the stock market is overvalued, undervalued, or about right? Well, I found that in 2000, before the all-time high of our price-earnings ratio, only about 30% of the American individual investors thought, and institutional as well, thought that the market was not overpriced. 70% thought it was overpriced, and it fell soon thereafter. Right now, it's about 50% think that the stock market is overpriced. So it's coming down. Confidence in the market has been falling, and the pricing is high. The third factor that I talked about in my August column was the sharp drop at the end of August in stock markets around the world. The US stock market dropped 10% in 5 days. How often did that happen? Well, I counted about 10 intervals like that since 1950. So it happens like once every 5 years. So it's not that extraordinary, but it is kind of extraordinary. And I think the way a major correction tends to occur is we get an episode like that. It scares people. And then there'll be a correction. Maybe we come back up. Then there's another episode like that, another episode. And then it gives kind of a seller's panic. That's what happened in 1929. That's what happened in 2000. That's what happened in 2007. So I see those factors. On the other hand, there's so many factors. The problem with predicting these markets is there's so many factors. And, oh, by the way, I just got MIT Press. I mentioned this, another MIT connection. Contacted me to contribute to a book called In 100 Years. And it had a couple of, I think, Robert Solow and Daron Acemoglu, if I'm pronouncing that right, from MIT, and others were contributed. And we were asked to predict what the economy will be like in 100 years. When I was asked to do that, I thought, I'll try hard. But then I just couldn't do it. 100 years is a long time. And I looked over all the other, I recommend reading the book. It's out for about a year now. But I have to say that nobody was convincing about what will happen in 100 years. But when you talk about the stock market, it's even more. There's so many historical, legal, technological factors you have to predict. It's the outcome of all of those things. I'm going on too long in one question. Oh, let me say one thing more about it. I think there's another force that might be propelling markets upward now, and that is our anxieties about technology and inequality. The emerging theme over not just the US, but over much of the world is robotics and computers and internet and communicate. Everyone's now carrying a smartphone in their pocket. There's 7.2 billion people in the world, and there's 6.7 billion mobile phones. something is changing, and this is changing rapidly. It wasn't like this 5 or 10 years ago. I think people are scared about where they fit into this. It looks like it might be a winner-take-all economy where there's a small, tiny percent of the world's population are super rich. And parents, I think, there are a lot of parents here, so I'll put it in your perspective. What are your kids going to be doing in 30 years? Well, they're lucky they're going to MIT. That's certainly lucky. But what are young people going to be doing? We have no idea. I think this is spooking people, and it's encouraging them. There's many other factors, but it's encouraging them to try to save more and to put money into things like the stock market in a maybe false hope that they'll be wealthy in the future and they'll escape from this risk of the labor market risk. Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to go back to your example of the guy buying candy. So the guy's in line at the grocery store. There's a bunch of candy there. He knows the candy tastes good but isn't healthy for him. Let's take the kid out of it. That complicates the analysis a bit.
Yeah.
So we have a grown adult capable of making his own decisions. Right. And the government comes in and says, we're going to help you make that decision by making grocery stores not put the candy there. That's what some people would argue. Or take the slot machine. Some woman likes playing the slots all the time. That's what she's decided to do with her money. Slot machine makers make the slot machines more fun, more appealing for her. The government says, I don't know if that's such a good idea. With the government making more and more of those sorts of decisions for individuals, what do you think that does to the fabric of a society built on individualism, to have government increasingly making decisions for people that a lot of us might argue they should just be able to make for themselves?
Well, that is the point that, incidentally, intelligent people differ on this point, as you must know. Why is it that there is so much disagreement about this point? I find it puzzling, and I think that people have emotional connections to different economic theories. Even the split between Republicans and Democrats is somewhat along these lines, but not dramatic. And I'm not a very political person, so I don't want to frame it that way. But you are talking about government. First of all, you're putting it entirely in a certain frame of government as a parent, and then population. Should we think of them as adults or children? So that's one metaphor, that the government is like a parent and we're the children. But I don't think of it that way. There's other ways to think about it. The examples I gave you of heroes were not from the government. Well, I think partly. The typical person might go between government jobs and private sector jobs and nonprofit jobs. We have all these different sectors. But I was careful not to emphasize Florence Kelley set up a nonprofit. It wasn't government. And even the government is influenced by lobbyists who defend interest. And right now, we have lobbyists representing different groups. I think that even corporate lobbyists are not evil people. I think the best thing is to have a balance where people in different groups are all contributing to help the government. But you know, we have a system, I think it's remarkable, we have a system that allows you to incorporate as a nonprofit. And MIT, by the way, is a nonprofit. Some of the greatest things happen from nonprofits. So that it isn't just about the government. I think of it as civil society, and thinking that it's really important that we have a civil society. It's not like we're treating people like children. It's about seeing somebody playing a trick on others, knowing that I don't have confidence that I won't fall victim to some fish. And we want to have fair play. We want to have a good system. But we do want free markets. Let me just add that I am an enthusiast for free markets. And in fact, I wrote a book in 1993 called Macro Markets, advocating creating new markets. And the reason why we have these Case-Shiller home price indices is we created home price indices for the express purpose of being traded on derivatives markets. in order to help manage the risk of home prices. This financial crisis we had was substantially due to lots of people borrowing to buy a house, encouraged by fishing, by people telling them that this is the smart thing to do. So they borrowed with all of their savings to buy a house that's worth, many times their income. And then the home price falls and they're wiped out. So that's an example of fishing. But I think that example could have been made better if the financial institutions had been more advanced. So I'm not presenting any clear anti-free, certainly not anti-free markets position. It's that we have to think as a society about how they really work. And sometimes we have to intervene. The problem is that you, as a businessman, cannot intervene on your own if you're operating under a tight profit margin. So Ogilvy was the founder of Ogilvy and Mather, the advertising company. At around the 1940s, he announced that his company would do no more cigarette advertising business because he realized that the cigarette were dangerous to your health. So he pulled out. It had absolutely no effect. The cigarette companies just shifted their account to somebody else who will do it. It didn't work. What did work was things like the National Anti-Smoking League that started lobbying, started making a stink about things that tobacco companies were doing to addict young people on cigarettes. And that eventually that was a big and important social movement, and it eventually was successful. Now less than 20% of the adult population smokes. I don't see anyone smoking here, right? If this were 1950, there'd be a cloud of tobacco in the air. So these things, it wasn't free markets that did this. It was heroes who had a social conscience. One more question. Okay. We need a microphone.
Just to change the topic a little bit here, as a Nobel luncheon, I want to ask kind of a two-part question about your Nobel experience. So what was the most memorable and what was the most unexpected part of the Nobel process for you?
I suppose the most memorable, I'm not sure. I was going to say dinner with the king of Sweden, because it kind of transported me back into the Middle Ages. We had to walk down a receiving line of lords and ladies, and at the end of the line was the king. I never felt so awkward. I didn't know what to say to these people. The most unexpected thing is how people now come up to me and say, "I'm honored to meet you." I can tell you, nobody ever said that to me before. Okay. Thank you.